Hey guys, and welcome back. In the previous video, we created a persistent volume in our Kubernetes cluster that we built on Amazon Elastic Block Store. So what we're doing is using something known as the static provisioning method for our persistent volume versus the dynamic provisioning method, which actually allows us to kind of bypass that previous step of explicitly creating the volume and then importing it into our cluster. But we're just kind of going the manual route for now so that we understand how each of these components works. So now what we need to do is actually spin up a pod that is connected to this persistent volume, and we do that by using something known as a persistent volume claim. So right now, if we do a describe on persistent volumes in our cluster, again, these are not namespaced resources, so when we run this, it's going to show all volumes for the entire cluster that the cluster is aware of. And so what you can see is that we've got our CBT Nuggets PV here with the 1 gig in size, and this is just basically making the cluster aware that the volume exists. We don't actually have any pods, any kind of workloads spun up on our cluster that are actually going to consume this storage. So to do that, we actually need to create a pod, but then we also need to create a persistent volume claim, which actually binds the PV over to the pod. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to switch over to my VS Code window here, and we'll do a new file here called pvclaim.yaml. And for starters, I'm just going to define a Kubernetes pod right here. And I'm going to use PowerShell again, just because I like to use it for kind of interactive demonstrations. And then I'm going to call the pod pvposh. And then we'll get rid of the labels here because we don't really need that. And then for the name of the container, we'll just call it pwsh. For our image, we'll do Microsoft/PowerShell. For our command entry point, we'll do PowerShell. And then for our args here, we're going to go ahead and do -command, and then we'll do wait event. And that'll, again, just kind of pause PowerShell. And then I'll get rid of the port down here, and I'll save this. And so at this point, we just have a basic pod spec. However, we need to actually bind the persistent volume over to the pod, and we do that with a persistent volume claim. So what we can actually do is in the same file here, do 3 dashes here, and then that will actually act as a separator for our spec file that we're going to submit to Kubernetes. And I'll just add a new resource. And if I type persistent volume here, you can see that I have templates for persistent volume as well as persistent volume claim. I'm going to choose the persistent volume claim instead. And then what we need to do here is actually specify the name of the PV claim. So I'll do posh PV claim. And then what I need to do is go ahead and actually configure the details for this persistent volume claim. So for the storage size here, I'm going to go ahead and do 1 gigabyte, which I know is going to match the persistent volume that I created before. And for our access modes, I'm going to do read write once because our persistent volume can only be attached to a single node at a single time. So let's go ahead and try to deploy this as is and see what we get. Now, I don't think this is going to work because we haven't actually linked the persistent volume claim over to the persistent volume, but we'll find that out here in just a moment. I'll do a kubectl apply on the file name. Let's go ahead and plug in our pvclaim.yaml. And if we attempt to apply that, it looks like it actually did create here. So let's see exactly what's happening at the moment. So we'll do a kubectl on and do a get on PVC, which is short for persistent volume claim. Again, you can confirm that when you actually do the API resources subcommand in kubectl. And if we go ahead and just do a describe on the PVC just to get a little bit more information about it, you'll see that it is waiting for the first consumer. Let me actually just get rid of my video here. It's waiting for the first consumer to be created before binding. Now, what is the consumer exactly? Well, the consumer that it's referring to is the pod that is linked to this persistent volume claim and is going to attempt to consume the persistent volume. So let's go ahead and do kubectl get pods and take a look at our pods here. And we've got the pod named pvpwsh. Let's do kubectl describe pod pvpwsh and just get some more details on that. And as you can see, it looks like this is up and running. So it pulled the PowerShell image, and then it created the new container inside of this pod, and this pod is currently running. However, at the moment, we have not actually mounted the persistent volume claim into the pod itself. So in order to do that, we'd actually have to create a mount point inside of the container configuration inside of our pod spec. But as you saw earlier, we didn't actually have the container up and running when we inspected the persistent volume claim. So let's go ahead and do a describe on the PVC again and see what it looks like. And as you can see, we're still getting this message saying waiting for first consumer to be created before binding. And I believe that that's just happening because we haven't actually specified a mount point for this PVC into the container. So let's go ahead and do that now. So let's go ahead and add in the volume section into the pod. So under my pod spec, I'll add volumes. And for the name, I'm just going to call this posh data. And then for the persistent volume claim, we need to actually refer to it as persistent volume claim as one of the volumes that we are going to mount into the pod. And then there is a property here that allows us to specify the claim name for the persistent volume claim that we would like to refer to. I'm going to go ahead and grab the name of the persistent volume claim that we plugged in right down here and go ahead and save that right up here. And now that we have imported this into the pod configuration, we now need to actually mount that into the container itself. So let's go ahead and add a volume mount section here, and I'll create a mount path called /bacon. And then for the name, we need to refer back to the name of the volume that we defined right here in the pod configuration, and that's going to be posh data. And so now we're going to essentially mount this particular persistent volume claim into the pod, and then we're going to mount this volume that we've defined inside the pod into the /bacon directory inside of the pod. So let's go ahead and try to do an apply on that, which will probably fail because we're changing a bunch of the pod spec config. Yeah, sure enough, it doesn't like that. It says pod updates cannot change fields other than image and active deadline seconds and tolerations. So basically what we need to do is just delete everything and start from scratch. So we'll go ahead and do kubectl delete on this PV claim. So we're leaving the persistent volume in place because we created that separately, but now we're actually we're going to delete the pod, delete the persistent volume claim, and then recreate it again. Let's do kubectl apply here and see what we get back. All right, so it looks like it created that, and we'll do kubectl describe PVC, and the name of our PVC is right here. So we'll go ahead and copy that, paste it in, and see what it looks like. So as you can see in the output right here, it says successfully provisioned volume, and it gives us the PVC ID right here using the AWS EBS driver, or provisioner rather, for this particular persistent volume claim. And if we do a kubectl get pods, we should see that our pod is in the running state. Sure enough, here it is. So now what we can do is exec into that. So I'll do an exec on the pvposh pod, and then we're going to go into the container, which is named, I believe it's just posh. So let's change the container name to posh, and then we're going to run PowerShell interactively inside of that container. And so if we do a get process, or GPS for short, sure enough, there's PID1, that's our entry point for our container. And if we do an ls here, you can see that we've got this bacon folder here, which that's our mount point for the persistent volume claim. So let's go ahead and cd into that directory here. And then I'll just go ahead and echo some text to a file. So let's go ahead and just do a bunch of randomized text here, and we'll put that into a file named test.txt. And if I do cat test.txt, sure enough, there's that gibberish text that we created. All right, so now what I'm going to do is actually exit out of that. And then what we're going to do is delete the pod. And then we're going to start up the pod again, and we'll see that that data has actually been persisted into that persistent volume. So let's go ahead and do that now. So we'll do a kubectl get pods, and then we'll do kubectl delete pod pv pwsh, and that should destroy our pod. Sure enough, there we go. Then we'll just do a get pods again to confirm that it's been deleted successfully, and then we'll go ahead and restart it again. So all right, it's gone, and let's go ahead and restart it again. We'll just do an apply on our PV claim, and that's going to basically say, all right, you didn't delete this PV claim, so that's going to be unchanged. However, it did recreate a brand new pod, and it should have mounted that claim into that pod. So let's actually just exec back into the same pod name. However, keep in mind that this is a brand new pod, even though it has the same name. We actually deleted it and then just recreated it with the same name. And if we do an ls, sure enough, we still have this bacon mount point right here. And if we do an ls on that bacon directory, we should see that we have this test.txt file inside of there. And if we cat bacon test.txt, there's the text that we previously wrote into this container. So basically what we're doing here is we're actually persisting data into an Amazon Elastic Block Storage device, which is our persistent volume. And then we're using this persistent volume claim to actually mount the EBS volume into a Kubernetes pod. And then we're able to persist data into that EBS volume outside of the pod lifecycle. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.